Well, welcome to the Kingdom People podcast. We are today having a chat with Dan Paterson. Dan Paterson has trained at the Oxford Centre of Christian Apologetics, spent several years with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, and is now stepping out, launching his own ministry called Questioning Christianity. He is a close personal friend of mine, and he is a great support to Bonnie and I in ministry. A real man of God that I respect, and I love hearing your insights into the gospel. Welcome to Kingdom People, Dan Paterson. How are you, my friend?
I am great, and it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's really cool to have you down here at Kingdom Hope. You just preached the gospel, you laid it all out in normal Dan Paterson fashion. So we thought we'd have a chat with you.
So you mean boring and laborious and...
No, not at all. Matter of fact, when I was promoting you this morning and telling everyone you have to get back to Dan, I was actually confessing my jealousy of how you preach the gospel. I was like, I covet this, I need to repent before the Lord.
Well, if you teach me how to get real hair back, then I'll teach you how to preach, and then we're have done. A proper cultural exchange.
Exactly. So you've spent many times, church is obviously your background, you've got a ministry background, you love being in the church with fellow Christians, sharing, obviously the gospel of Jesus, but your frontline ministry, you're out there in schools, universities, you're out there where people have real serious questions about our worldview and about our belief system.
Totally.
What's that like, being out there where people aren't fans all the time?
It's fun. I used to be terrified of public speaking. That was my number one fear. I was one of those guys that said I would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy at the funeral. Right. So it's hilarious that 15 years later of following Jesus, this is kind of where I am. But I just think that the Christian story is really good news. And the ability to go out where people don't know about Jesus or don't have the ability to make sense of their life with reference to God and don't have all of the aspects that brings, the dimensions that brings, what Jesus would say, life to the full. I just love being able to talk about that and so really connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. It's nerve-wracking at times. You never know what questions will come. No one necessarily believes the same as you. Some people have all kinds of angry objections that come from real experiences or hurts or concerns that they have. And so you just never know what's coming. And so being able to do that, really serve God in that way, I find it thrilling.
Well, you're literally on the coalface of ministry. What's the landscape in Australia look like in regards to where the gospel intersects with mainstream society? What's that look like?
It's mixed, as it always has been at every point in Christian history. One of my friends and mentors, Dave Benson, he talks about now we live in a culture that is post-Christian in attitude. So we've been in our past, we tried the religion thing, we've done Christianity, we've got the t-shirt, no thanks. So we're post-Christian in attitude, but now pre-Christian in understanding, is that the vast majority of people that you interact with, particularly younger people, schools and unis, haven't been in contact with the church, haven't really grown up in a religious family, don't really understand much about God. And if you talk about people in the Bible characters or stories, have almost zero familiarity. So it's sort of like a blank slate. All that they really know has come more through pop media or social media kind of posts. And so it's really an interesting place when they're post-Christian attitude, but they don't really know what it's about. So they end up rejecting something that they've never really understood in the first place. But for the most part, I think Aussies are just pretty apathetic when it comes to religion questions, So whether God exists or not, my life's pretty good. I don't really think I need to think much about the God stuff. And so because they don't see the relevance of how Christian story speaks to life, they're just not all that interested. Happy to go surfing, happy to party with friends. Right. And so apathy would probably be the biggest kind of challenge. But on where does sort of the attitude towards Christianity sit? There's definitely been a shift over the last 20 years in terms of what used to be maybe a shared ethic, culturally speaking, between Christianity and its historic kind of development and then Western society. But there's definitely more of a divergence that's happening there as to what's considered good or normal in broader culture, particularly in areas around sexuality and human identity, but in others as well. And so Christianity has gone from being either, it's part of what we are, perhaps a chaplain to the culture, to being not really part of what we are, but relatively harmless, to now being thought of as being quite dangerous to some, that perhaps the Christian story is harmful to people's formation, or look what the Christian church has done in its history, or more recently with the skeletons in the closet, the Crusades and Inquisitions, or sadly, the child sex scandals. It's a really mixed reception that people have when it comes to Christianity and the church, such that the church, if you list all the possible institutions, apart from a prison, the church is about the last thing that people want in their local suburb.
Is that right?
Yeah, it comes right down at 15 out of all the things, parks and cafes and schools and community centres and everything like this. The church is right down the bottom. And so most people are relatively warm towards Christians, but for the church as an institution or as a thing, very wary.
So is that part of just the broader move away from institutions in general, or do you think that there's some specific things in Christianity that we either need to address or have addressed?
Yeah, I think certainly it's a challenge in framing what God is like. In the absence of people framing God right, people will frame him through their own experiences. And the challenge is when you look at the bad Christian background, as well as when you try and make sense of life's deepest questions, but don't really know what the Christian story says, you're assuming you know what it says, is you just end up with these funny ideas about God that don't at all reflect Christianity. And so in the US, this is now old research, but some 15 years ago, all of the sociological data about what people thought Christianity was, they said that's not Christianity. That's something they called moral therapeutic deism. The idea that there's a God who exists, he lives in heaven, he wants you to be good, he's there you can pray to if you need something, and good people go to heaven when they die, bad people go to hell. That was kind of the understanding of what their cultural religion was. And many people in Australia have that idea about Christianity, where almost none of those are actually true of the God as revealed through Jesus or through the Christian story. And so I just think a lot of it is Christians not doing public Christianity well. We've assumed that people know, and we don't know how to translate the message and be flexible messengers anymore to reach the culture, as well as people having bad experiences, and that kind of frames their attitude towards the church.
So on the one hand, it's a blank slate, but on the other hand, there's some cultural perceptions about Christianity which probably weren't accurate to begin with. How do we, as followers of Christ, and actually navigate that when we are telling the Christian story to our friends, our colleagues, our neighbours? It's
a great question. And I find that where someone has an objection or a hard question, that's where Christians tend to want to answer. So someone will bring up something about politics or something about sexuality. And like, all right, that's my in. But almost always, if you jump in trying to defend Christianity or prove that Christianity is true, here's all the evidence, you're almost invariably going to be trying to convince them that a God that they don't want to exist exists.
Right.
The picture of God that they had, that God is a totalitarian dictator, or that he's like a straitjacket restricting my moral freedoms, or that he just wants to judge people for the bad things that they've done and throw them into hell where he'll delight in them being tormented. Like, that's the kind of picture of God that a lot of people still have in their mind. And so if you go in and try and convince them God is real, well, you've got all kinds of motivated reasoning in them that don't want that to be real, so their ears just aren't opened. And my general approach is to try and get people to think through, how do I frame God right by retelling the Christian story afresh? Mm-hmm. Just assume that people don't know what the Bible's all about, and particularly how it pieces together. And given that most Christians I talk to don't know how to share that, it's probably a pretty safe assumption that most non-Christians certainly don't know how to do that.
Right.
And so even in the book that I've just written, or in the videos and training stuff that I've got online, always try and walk through what is the big story of the Bible, how we were made for good, and how that explains so much about human dignity and value and worth, and our drive for purpose, and our desire to be loved and to love our relational kind of nature, even our rationality and our ability to do science and have a world that is natural. All of this is wrapped up in God's creation of a good world. And then everyone asks, well, what's wrong with the world? And why is it the way that things are? This doesn't look like the world that a loving God would make. Well, that's because scene 2 explains how the world became damaged by evil. That through our abuse of our freedom, we have cut our relationship with God, turned our back on God and the entire world system, because we were meant to be the gardeners and governors of God's good world. Man, if you don't look after your garden for a while, it goes wild.
Sure.
And so the system itself now is broken, and that's why humans have this innate reaction that this is not the way that things should be, which is an impulse that only makes sense if we were created for good but have become damaged by evil. And then you share how God responds in Jesus, all the whispers that pointed towards him, and all of the ways in which the Old Testament prefigured Jesus so that we can understand his significance. Then all of a sudden you have God turning up in human form to tell us exactly what God is like. That if Jesus said, you've seen me, you've seen the Father, I and the Father are one. Well, if you want to know what God's like, reframe your understanding through Jesus. Because the weirdest thing is most people in our culture are pretty open to Jesus. They like Jesus.
Right.
They just don't like Christians, and they don't like God. And you think, well, let me reframe. God is what Jesus looks like. He is the perfect window, the exact representation of his image. He is the invisible God made visible, right? And Christians are meant to be like Jesus. Yeah. And so where they fall, that's not because Christianity is no good. It's simply because they have the same freedom and haven't kind of lived up to it. So I really try and get people to reframe their understanding of God through Jesus, because if they're drawn to him, they're actually drawn towards God. And the things that Jesus promises to bring justice through judgment, to wipe away the horizon of evil, to heal all of the symptoms of suffering that are in the world, those are things that everyone in this generation is longing for, to see justice and to see things set right and to see the oppressed lifted up and to see healing come. That's what Jesus offers through the gospel. That's what he promises he'll do when he comes back. And so you start walking through this Christian story and it just reframes the way that people think. And it's sort of a Blaise Pascal approach of make people wish it were true and then show them that it is.
Right.
So it's not leading with, here's why you should believe that God exists. Let me just make sure that you understand God the way he's revealed in the Bible. Oh, that sounds like really good news. Hey, if there was a God who loved you, made you for a purpose, is able to forgive sin and offer you eternal life and help reorient you around a community that is life-giving. For most people, nearly every area of the Christian story is good news. It's just then when they hear it, and they're like, oh yeah, that would be cool, or I want that to be true. And then you can come in with the evidence and the reasons and the arguments. And well, faith isn't a blind leap in the dark. It's following the evidence where it points to step into the light, to trust God, how he's revealed himself in Jesus.
So by changing the narrative, we can then obviously change the perception.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what you see happening in PR spin all around the world.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
It's just a question about whether the story is true.
Right.
So it's not using underhanded or manipulative techniques,
Yeah.
but it's just telling the Christian story the way it reveals God and then saying,
Yeah.
you can actually step into this. This is a real story.
Yeah.
It's not just a good idea, it's good news. It's an announcement about what God has done in history through Jesus.
Yeah, I really like that. The only thing is, though, like you've just pretty much answered the question to life, meaning, and everything in like 5 minutes, really simply and beautifully. But you were trained at the Oxford Centre of Christian Apologetics. You worked with Ravi Zacharias, and you did it so simplistically and beautifully. I'm thinking about giving my heart to Jesus again. Like that's how good you are at it.
That's good. We should do it every day.
We should do it every day. But what about like the everyday Christian who is a plumber, a worker, a business manager, an accountant? They're in their workplace. They don't necessarily have your education background. Is there a way which we can quickly, simply, and effectively retell the Christian narrative and story?
Yeah, so those sort of 6 scenes that I use in the book, I've got training videos online. There'll be a ton of stuff that comes up when the questioningchristianity.com website goes live. But it just sort of helpful anchor phrases. Created for good.
Right.
Damaged by evil. Israel were chosen to bless. Jesus came to restore us for better. The church is sent together to heal, and then Jesus will return to set everything right. And if you've just got these anchor phrases, created for good, damaged by evil, chosen to bless, restored for better, sent to heal, and set everything right. It just helps you with like a memory thing. And this is really what it comes down to. It's a willingness to practice. It's a willingness to get better at telling our story.
Okay.
And the thing that just seems crazy to me, whether you're a pastor or not, whether you studied at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics or whether you studied for the YouTube favorite sermon jam that you watch, it doesn't matter where you've studied.
Sure.
It's the willingness to say, look, if I was a plumber, I would make sure that I do all the things that are necessary for me to complete my practical examination so that I can get registered.
Yeah.
If I was going to do a major exam, if I become a GP and I had to finish my specialization, I'm going to study like crazy to be able to pass that exam because it matters then for the rest of my life. Just think, when it comes to the Christian story, we are his witnesses. Mm-hmm. It's not an optional extra. We are his witnesses. People will make their decisions about Jesus and the gospel because of what they hear and see from Christians. And I just think it's crazy that if we spend so much time investing into training for our muscles or studying for our exams, that we spend no time thinking about how can I more helpfully share the Christian story. And so if you have an example of it, just a 1 or 2 minute version of it, like what I've got online, then go away and practice. And so what I do with guys that I'm mentoring or discipling is every time we get together, they will read some of the Bible together, we'll go over what's happening in their world, but we always do something called Gospel in a Minute, which is where they have to do that, tell that whole story from beginning to end in a minute or two. And at the end of it, we say, how was that? What made sense? What didn't? What would you change? What must be cut out? What phrases are too insider language? People from haven't grown up in church won't understand that. And what are concepts that you could use that would really connect with where people are coming from, what they're experiencing? And so at the beginning, it sounds like they took a Bible, put it in a blender, drank that milkshake, and then vomited it up on you. Like it's just ugly and bad.
Sure.
But after practicing time and time again, all of a sudden by the end of it, it's natural, it's in their own words, and it's just really useful. And so if you've got something to start with, just some notes that I've got available to use as sort of your frame and then put your own flesh on it, I think it's great. Just rehearse, learn, practice. And that's the thing, like I didn't start out preaching. I didn't start out giving talks in universities and schools. I started out having conversations about my own doubts. And then I started having conversations with other people about their doubts. And then I started teaching little Bible studies with students in youth group. And then I started running a life group for young adults where you're working through the Bible and helping to answer their questions. And at every point, you're making a ton of mistakes and learning from what not to do as much as what to do. But it's only by practice and habit that it gets easier over time.
So I really love the way you're putting this. And this is actually one of the big aspects of your ministry, Question Christianity, is training and equipping Christians how to share the gospel effectively through narrative evangelism. Not only that, but also training and equipping pastors how to train their congregations.
Totally.
You also do have a big part of that ministry, though, Questioning Christianity, in going into universities and schools. And you love talking to skeptics.
Yeah.
Tell me, what are some of the biggest, most brazen doubts and questions and skeptical kind of thoughts that you deal with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm convinced that every question I've ever been asked breaks down into one of two questions.
Right.
And the first bucket is it true? Mm-hmm. So is what you're coming to tell me about God, about Jesus, about what difference that makes in my life, is that true? And so think through questions which would be, God and science are at war. You can either choose one or the other, but you can't have both, which is just a lie. It's just a myth. But that's a popularly believed myth. So 49% of people in Australia, those who say that they have no religious affiliation on the census data, which is now about a 32% slice of the Australian, but 49% of them, when they're asked why no religion, they say, because I prefer a science or evidence-based approach to forming my beliefs. So half of them are convinced that you have to choose between science and religion, or between faith and fact, or revelation and reason. And I just think that that's a travesty. But is it true? That's what they're asking. When it comes down to look at this old dusty religious book, I get that a lot. It's outdated, it's outmoded, it's backwards, it's trying to impose on us a system that'll be damaging. I'm like, actually, no, there's a lot going for the Bible. Not only just fascinating from a point of literature, not only just understanding its makeup as sort of a literary constellation, but looking at, are there good reasons to believe that what it says about reality is true, that there is a creator that stands behind creation, that there are historical markers all throughout it, that there are key events and people and places that are being sort of verified over time by archaeology, but particularly around the claims of Jesus, the gospel stories, the eyewitness data. And so they're asking, is it true? So they're probably the big ones on the truth side. The more important questions, the thorny ones, the ones that really keep people back, are in the second bucket, and all has to do with the question of, is God good?
Right.
Is God good? Can I really trust him? Can I really believe that God has my good at heart? And actually, this vein of doubt traces all the way back into Genesis chapter 3. When you look at how the snake starts talking with Adam and Eve, and the conversation around, why don't you take some of this fruit? No, God said, if we shall not eat of it, nor shall we touch it, lest we die. And he said, did God really say that? And it begins to call into question, God doesn't want you to eat it because he knows that when you do eat of it, you will become like him, knowing good and evil. In other words, the temptation is God's holding out on you.
Wow.
He's holding you back.
Yeah.
You could be more without him. You could reach for something and become something more. And so you can't really trust that God loves you and has your best intentions at heart. And this doubt is really the super vein of doubt that flows all throughout the Bible, and the skepticism that comes up. And it's the, why isn't God more obvious? Or why does God not answer my prayers? Why does he seem hidden from me in times of trouble? It's the, where is God in a world full of suffering sort of a question, which is the perennial one that keeps coming up. But even the moral questions around, sexuality is just such a big barrier for so many, particularly high schoolers, where sexuality and gender. And I think the Christian story has beautiful things to say in putting sex and marriage in its rightful place. I think our culture both idolizes it to a crazy degree and de-elevates it to a crazy degree. So in all of these sorts of thorny questions, my goal is really, yes, you've got that question, but underneath it, what you're really asking is God good and can you trust him? And that's where I'm actually trying to point my answer. But that's probably the most thorny ones, the suffering and sexuality kind of stuff.
What's some of your great stories? Because obviously you this isn't just speeches you give, you're actually dealing with people. And one of the things I love that Rabbi Zacharias says is, we're not trying to win an argument, we're trying to win a person.
Yeah.
So what's some of the great stories that you've had in your ministry answering these tough questions?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And it's fun kind of thinking back over that time because I remember once we were in a Welsh university over in the UK and there was a guy, my friend was speaking on science and God at this lunchtime talk in a bar full of people, some that came for the talk, others that were just in the bar at the time and unfortunately had to listen to the talk for them. But there was this one guy that was dressed sort of half homeless, half gothic kind of style, comes in, sits down at a table sort of halfway through the talk, and the Q&A hits on, first hand to shoot up, and he stands up and he is angry and aggressive in his language, and he's insanely intelligent, and he just loads this barrage of attack onto my friend. And I was sort of sitting there going, man, I'm glad I'm not in the hot seat right now, because this is really hard to kind of handle. But the guy gets to the end of it, and his critique was so, let's just, in intelligent words, that the vast majority of people there, you just didn't understand what he was saying. They're like, what's this guy angry about?
Right.
But he came and sat down at my table, and it was about science and God, the talk, but his real objections had nothing to do with that. And he had a number of good friends that were women, and he felt like the history of Christianity has just been deeply oppressive, and the Bible's message is oppressive to women, which I don't think is true in what the Bible's intention and message is, but also on the sexuality question. So really big on the LGBT rights, and it seems like in his mind the church was set up as an opponent of the LGBT community, and so a lot of this came out over conversation, and we had such a good talk that I remember sharing the Christian story. I'm like, you have a picture of God that is nothing like the picture of God that I have in my mind. And turns out the guy is a Welsh debating champion. He was the president of the debating chapter there at that university, and they'd actually won amongst all of the other universities. But as I said, look, do you mind if I just shared the Christian story? As I've got a couple of theology degrees. I've spent a fair bit of time trying to make sense of the Bible. Would you be willing for me just to share it in just a few minutes to help you get a sense of where these questions fit in? He's like, sure. And as I was sharing the Christian story, like I was talking about before, there was this moment when I was talking about Jesus where his eyes literally filled up with tears. And I had this profound moment of just realizing God's breaking in here. He's got all of these different objections, but as I'm talking about Jesus, God's breaking in here. And all of a sudden the shutters come back down, and there was almost like he'd steeled himself in his skepticism. And he goes on to share, well, my parents are both atheists. I've grown up doing atheist debates. That's just a little bit kind of his world. But we got on so well that he invited me and one of my other friends, who's actually a PhD in philosophy from Oxford. He's a tutor at Oxford. I'm glad he was on my team, but to come and do a debate later that week with his debating society. And we just had so much fun building a friendship over that, and went out for a couple of drinks after. And it wasn't that he had a come to Jesus moment at the end of that story, but he came in thinking that the Christians were going to be like something. And then I listened to his concerns, and I shared Jesus, and he just realized, I don't have a problem with you or with that. If that's what it really is, I've got no problem here. And actually, that's probably one of my favorite stories. I've got tons of people come into faith. I had one young guy down in Melbourne at a church that I spoke at. He came along from the local university, did a talk on why I'm not an atheist. He came and asked me a question afterwards about the Trinity. He's like, I don't understand the Trinity. This doesn't make sense to me. And I shared maybe 5 or 10 minutes on the Trinity with him and just said, does that help make sense? He's like, yeah, okay, I think I'm ready to become a Christian now. He becomes a Christian after hearing me answer a question on the Trinity. So you just think, that's definitely God at work, because there's no way any human explaining the Trinity usually leads to a come to Jesus kind of moment.
Sure.
But you see these times of people becoming Christians, but I really also appreciate those where people are just softened as well. They had a perception that God was one way. At the end of it, they say, oh, if that's what God's really like, then I guess I don't really have a problem. I'm not there yet. I haven't encountered him. I'm not drawn to it yet, but there's something about that that's melted my skepticism in a way, or at least my hardened kind of attitude towards it. For me, they're big win moments.
I love both of those stories, and it's so true. It's, often it's the seeds that are sown, and sometimes we're actually at the end of that run of seeds, and we see the harvest come to fruition. But then other times we just plant the seed, and maybe just a little bit of growth or another step towards knowing Jesus is just as powerful and just as successful. So I really love both those stories. Listen, it's Dan Paterson. He runs a ministry called Questioning Christianity. I encourage you to go check it out, questioningchristianity.com. If you want resources or wanting to get in contact with them, maybe you're wanting to actually get a bit of support in how to get better trained evangelists in your church, or maybe you yourself want to get better trained in how to tell the narrative of the Christian story. Listen, Dan, we're going to hang around. We've actually got some people here, the live audience in Kingdom People today. We may even take 1 or 2 questions from them while we got you in the hot seat. Anybody got a PhD in philosophy? That maybe, no, it should be fairly safe then. But listen, you hang around for another episode.
Great.
That'd be really good. Listen, you can check out more of our Kingdom People podcasts on any of the podcast apps on any other iOS or Android devices, or you can head to kingdomhope.com.au and check out our content there. We will be back soon with Dan Paterson.